After that night in the Mustang, Leah Walker did the worst possible thing she could have done. She behaved normally, which Caroline discovered by Monday afternoon was harder to live with than if Leah had said something reckless or awkward or even remotely useful. Instead, Leah came in at 8:15 in black tailoring and a white shirt, set a revised calendar on Caroline's desk, and informed her that the donor breakfast had moved by 30 minutes and that the development notes she'd asked for on Friday were already waiting by the window. No mention of the call. No reference to the drive. Nothing about the fact that for one long suspended second outside Caroline's building, the air between them had stopped feeling professionally survivable. Caroline had looked up from the folder, held Leah's gaze a beat too long, and said, very evenly, "You're efficient this morning." Leah had answered, just as evenly, "You're late this morning." And that had been that. No one else in the room would have heard anything at all in the exchange. Caroline heard too much. By Tuesday, she had discovered that silence could be its own form of escalation. By Wednesday, her jokes had sharpened. Not cruelly. Caroline wasn't cruel by instinct and never would be. But the edges had changed. The warmth was still there, the bright social ease, the laughter that made rooms soften around her without noticing. Underneath it, though, there was something cooler now. More polished. More precise. A small private blade she had not needed before. Leah noticed. She noticed when Caroline smiled a little too sweetly after being corrected. She noticed when the word "fine" came out smooth enough to sound harmless and cold enough not to be. She noticed when Caroline's expression stayed perfectly social while something in her eyes became much less forgiving. She said nothing about it, which somehow made it worse. Rachel and Camille noticed by midweek. By Friday, they were done pretending not to. "You are impossible," Rachel said, standing near the windows of Caroline's office with a coffee she had not been invited to bring in and absolutely no remorse about it. "I've seen you in denial before. Usually it's prettier." Camille, seated in one of the guest chairs with one leg crossed over the other, looked up from her phone. "The jokes have gotten colder." Caroline signed the last page on a contract packet and handed it across the desk without looking up. "You both need a more demanding hobby." "That is not a denial," Rachel said cheerfully. Caroline leaned back in her chair and studied them with mild suspicion. Rachel was in dark brown silk and gold hoops, all warm mischief and dangerous affection. Camille, in black and camel with a clean ivory blouse under her coat, looked exactly like the kind of woman who never needed to raise her voice because the room came to her instead. "What exactly is wrong with the two of you today?" "Concern," Rachel said. "Curiosity," Camille corrected. "Vindication," Rachel said. Caroline laughed once under her breath. "I'm surrounded by predators." "No," Rachel said. "You're surrounded by women who have known you too long." That part, unfortunately, was true. Rachel had known her since adolescence. Camille nearly as long. They had watched Caroline survive bad dates, worse instincts, one regrettable rebound, and more than one woman who had mistaken chemistry for compatibility. They knew when she was amused. They knew when she was distracted. And they definitely knew when something had gotten under her skin deeply enough to alter the weather around her. Caroline reached for her coffee and found it cold. She looked at it, set it back down, and immediately regretted how readable that probably was. Rachel saw it anyway. "There," she said softly. "That thing." Caroline glanced up. "What thing?" "That tiny moment where your whole face goes still because your mind has wandered somewhere you don't want to be caught visiting." Camille lowered her phone. "What happened in the car?" Caroline should have laughed. She should have said something vague and polished and impossible to hold on to. That had been her preferred method for years whenever people drifted too close to anything she wasn't ready to name. Instead, because the last week had left her with too much awareness and nowhere useful to put it, she said, "I'm not ready to describe it yet." The room went very still. Not dramatically. Worse than that. Informatively. Rachel's expression changed first, less amused, more satisfied in that dangerous, affectionate way only old friends could manage when they realized something had shifted for real. Camille said nothing for a beat. Then, very quietly, "That's enough of an answer." Caroline stood and moved toward the side table, mostly because she needed to do something with her body. "You're both enjoying this far too much." Rachel watched her with shameless interest. "No, sweetheart. I'm enjoying the fact that for once you don't have a perfect sentence ready." Camille's tone stayed calmer, but no less pointed. "And I'm enjoying that whoever unsettled you seems to have done it properly." Caroline turned back toward them. "I have been unsettled before." Rachel smiled. Small, knowing, infuriating. "Not like this." That line landed closer than Caroline wanted it to. Because the truth was, this was different. Not simply attraction. Caroline knew what attraction felt like. She knew what it was to enjoy someone's attention, to exchange polished danger over dinner, to flirt because the evening had turned warm, and because wanting and being wanted were both easier than loneliness. This was more annoying than that. More specific. It had shape now. Rhythm. Memory. It lived in ordinary moments. In the way Leah had said 10 minutes on the phone, like a woman trying very hard not to let that sentence mean more than it already did. In the way she had been waiting beside the Mustang in black denim and leather, as if she had no idea what that sight would do to anyone with functioning judgment. In the way she had looked at Caroline in the car afterward, steady, self-contained, almost unreadably calm, while the whole interior had felt one wrong movement away from becoming something impossible to walk back. Caroline had not spent the week replaying that. She had spent the week trying not to notice that she was replaying it. The knock on the open office door came at exactly the right moment to save her from her friends. Leah stepped in with a folder in one hand and a tablet in the other. Back in black. A perfectly cut black suit, white shirt beneath it, dark hair smooth, expression controlled, every line of her so precisely in place that for one absurd second Caroline felt relieved by the sight of it. This at least made sense. This was the version of Leah she had spent the week pretending not to be affected by. The one who could stand in a doorway and make a room feel smaller without changing her pulse. Rachel noticed Caroline noticing. "Naturally. There she is," Rachel murmured. "Our mob boss." Leah's gaze found Caroline first. Only briefly. Long enough. Then she said, "Tomorrow. 7. Rachel blinked. "Good evening to you too." Leah spared her exactly one glance. "You're with Henry." Rachel set down her coffee and smiled. "We are." "Yes." Camille, now visibly interested, asked, "And Caroline?" Leah looked at Caroline again. "She's with me." It was the calmest sentence in the world. That was what made it so dangerous. Caroline, who had spent all week feeling unsettled by everything that had not been said after the Mustang, went very still. Rachel's brows rose. Camille's mouth shifted, just barely. Caroline should have made a joke then. Something easy. Something managerial. Something about routes or timing or practicality. Instead she said, "At 7? Leah gave one short nod. "Be ready at 7. No flourish. No explanation. Just that low-level certainty, as if the matter had already been decided somewhere private and sensible, and everyone else was late catching up. Rachel crossed one ankle over the other, and looked between them with shameless interest. "I have to say, that sounded less like logistics and more like a command." "It was logistics," Caroline said. Leah, maddeningly, did not help her. Camille tilted her head toward Leah. "Do you always organize weekends like military operations, or does Caroline get special treatment?" Leah set the folder on Caroline's desk. "Only the timing. The rest is weather dependent." Rachel made a delighted little sound. "There's the problem." She says things like that with a straight face. Caroline took the folder, more for something to do with her hands than because she needed it immediately. And what exactly am I supposed to wear for this highly classified departure? Leah's eyes moved over her once. Cool. Brief. Entirely too aware. Something you can walk in. That landed much too cleanly. Rachel turned away as if physically unable to contain herself. Oh, I'm obsessed with this now. Caroline kept her face composed and looked at Leah instead. That is a remarkably vague instruction. Leah's voice stayed even. You'll survive it. And there it was again. That infuriating specific kind of care she insisted on dressing as efficiency, as if precision could somehow make everything between them less charged instead of more. Rachel rose first, smoothing down her skirt. Well, since apparently my husband and I have been assigned to secondary transport, I suppose we should go. Camille stood more slowly, one hand gathering her bag. I do enjoy that she never explains herself. That's because explanations invite debate, Leah said. Rachel looked at Caroline. Sweetheart, if you come in tomorrow looking the way you did on Monday after that car ride, I'm moving into your guest room until you tell me everything. Caroline's smile sharpened. Not cruelly. Just enough. You'd last 6 hours before Leah had you removed for disruptive emotional noise. Rachel put a hand to her chest. There she is. Leah did not react. Caroline hated how much she noticed that too. Leah's attention returned to Caroline. Don't be late tomorrow. Then she turned and left as cleanly as she had entered. Black suit, controlled stride, no visible interest in the effect she had just left behind her. Rachel waited until the door clicked shut. Then, well, Camille picked up her coat. Yes. Caroline looked at both of them with suspicion. You're unbearable. Rachel linked her arm through Camille's on the way to the door. No, darling. We're observant. By the time the three of them came downstairs to the lobby, the building had already taken on that late evening sheen Caroline had always liked. Glass darker now, marble warmer under low light, the whole place transitioning from business into something quieter and more polished in mood. Henry was waiting near the front entrance with one hand in his coat pocket and the expression of a man who had absolutely no intention of behaving badly and every intention of noticing everything. Rachel reached him first and took his arm. Caroline stepped out just behind them and saw the black Mustang at the curb. Leah was already there. Not leaning against it this time. Just opening the driver's door, one hand on the roofline, black suit still immaculate, city light catching the clean dark shape of her as she slid behind the wheel like the car had been built to fit her specifically. Caroline stopped for half a second without meaning to. Henry saw it. Rachel definitely saw it. Camille, of course, had probably seen it before Caroline herself did. Henry exhaled softly. Oh. Rachel's mouth curved. Exactly. Caroline looked away from the Mustang a fraction too late. That only made it worse. Leah started the engine, checked the mirror, and pulled out into traffic without once looking back toward the building. Which, for reasons Caroline found both irrational and immediate, irritated her. Rachel turned toward her with delight barely held in check. Well, that was subtle. It was a car, Caroline said. Henry opened the rear door of his own car for Rachel. No. It was timing. Camille adjusted her coat and looked toward Caroline's waiting driver, who had just stepped forward to open her door. Tomorrow should be interesting. Caroline pulled on her gloves with more composure than she felt. You all need harder lives. Rachel was still smiling as she got into Henry's car. 7 o'clock, darling. Try not to spend the whole night thinking about Black Mustang and impossible women. Caroline shut her own car door before Rachel could say anything worse. And yet the whole ride home felt a little too long, a little too quiet, and far too available for memory. By the time Caroline reached her building, one thing was clear. Tomorrow had already begun. At 6:48 the next morning, Caroline was already downstairs. She would later refuse to examine what that said about her. The lobby was quiet in the particular way expensive buildings were quiet on weekend mornings, soft-footed, half-lit, polished into obedience. Outside, October had sharpened the air but not yet turned cruel. The city was still stretching awake. Caroline stood near the entrance in cream trousers, a navy and white striped knit, and a light camel coat left open over it. Flat leather shoes instead of heels. Gold at her ears, sunglasses in her bag, hair loose but controlled. The kind of look people called effortless when they had no idea how much thought went into making effort disappear. She was not dressing for Leah. She was dressing for the lake. That distinction, Caroline told herself, mattered. The black Mustang pulled up at exactly 7. Of course it did. No flourish. No dramatic slowdown. Just the clean arrival of a woman who had meant what she said the night before and saw no need to romanticize punctuality. Leah got out first this time. Not in office black. Not in the leather jacket from last Saturday night. Something simpler. Dark denim, a black tee, a practical olive field jacket, boots that looked like they had actually touched weather before. Her hair was pulled back more loosely than during the week, a few darker strands already moving in the wind. Sunglasses in one hand, keys in the other. She looked less formal, less armored, not softer. Caroline hated how quickly her body understood the difference. Leah came around to the passenger side, opened the door, took one look at Caroline and said, "Good? You listened." Caroline slid into the seat with as much dignity as the sentence allowed. "You're impossible before coffee." Leah shut the door for her, walked around the hood, and got in behind the wheel. "You look awake enough to survive me. I'd like it noted that this is not how gracious hosts usually speak. You are not my guest yet." Caroline turned slightly in her seat. "What am I then?" Leah started the engine. Early. That should not have made Caroline smile. It did. They pulled away from the curb with the city still mostly to themselves. For the first 20 minutes, the silence between them was not awkward so much as precise. Too many things had already been laid down between them, and too many more were waiting to be named badly if either woman chose the wrong words. Caroline watched the skyline recede in the side mirror, then the widening road ahead. "You planned this very efficiently," she said after a while. Leah kept her eyes on the road. "That sounds suspiciously like praise. It sounds suspiciously like I'm being polite. That's more alarming." Caroline leaned back into the leather seat. "I should have known you'd make a 7 a.m. departure feel like military transport." Leah's mouth moved at one corner. That was almost affectionate. "Don't get used to it." "I won't." The answer was soft enough to keep the car from cooling. Different now. Less office steel. Less dry sparring. It wasn't that Leah had stopped being herself. Outside the city. Outside the floor plans and deadlines and carefully controlled entrances to Caroline's office, something in her no longer needed to stay so tightly buttoned. They stopped once for coffee at a roadside place with actual ceramic mugs and surprisingly good pastries. Leah came back to the car with 2 coffees and a paper bag without asking what Caroline wanted. Caroline took the cup, looked down into it, then up at her. "You remembered. You're predictable before 9. That was less charming than I hoped." "It wasn't meant to charm you." Caroline held the coffee for a second, letting the heat settle into her hands. "And yet," Leah didn't answer that. The lake announced itself before the house did. Not visually at first. Through the light. Through the sudden sense of space. Then the road curved, trees broke, and a long silver-blue stretch appeared beyond the last row of houses, carrying that quiet, cold authority only large bodies of water had. Caroline turned slightly toward the passenger window. Leah noticed. "You forget how big it is if you stay in the city too long." "I didn't forget," Caroline said. "I just didn't realize I missed it." Leah glanced at her once. "That happens too." The house sat back from the shore with the relaxed confidence of something that had hosted beautiful people for decades without ever becoming self-conscious about it. Weathered wood. Stone. A wide back lawn sloping toward the water. Groups of people already scattered, with drinks, sunglasses, layers in cream, navy, sand, and black. The sort of Saturday gathering where half the guests were genuinely fond of each other, and the other half at least knew how to behave as if they were. There were more of them than just Rachel, Henry, and Camille, as expected. Couples. Old friends. Someone Henry played golf with and privately judged. A woman Camille knew from a donor board. Rachel's husband's cousin with a tan that implied both leisure and weak boundaries. Exactly the kind of lakeside weekend circle that had its own habits, its own inside jokes, its own unspoken seating arrangements. Rachel spotted them first from the lawn and lifted one hand high above her head with all the discretion of a signal flare. Henry was with her, sunglasses on, one arm folded, already smiling before they were close enough to greet him. Caroline got out of the Mustang, smoothing one hand once over the front of her coat before she could stop herself. Leah came around the other side of the car and, without comment, took the tote bag from the back seat and slung it over one shoulder, as if that too had already been decided. That small gesture irritated Caroline on principle. It also made something warmer than irritation move under her ribs. Rachel kissed Caroline on the cheek the moment she reached them. "You survived the drive." Henry nodded toward Leah. "And she brought you on time." "Remarkable." Camille, wrapped in ivory and chocolate with a silk scarf at her throat, looked from one woman to the other and said, "The atmosphere is deeply educational." Leah only handed Caroline the sunglasses she had left in the car and said, "The host wants everyone toward the terrace first. Then drinks. Then lunch." Rachel stared at her. "Do you arrive everywhere with an internal program?" "Yes," Leah said. Henry laughed under his breath. "I like her more every time I see her." "That's because she's not managing you," Caroline said. Rachel linked her arm through Caroline's and lowered her voice just enough to make it dangerous. "You still haven't described the car." Caroline slipped on her sunglasses and kept her face angled toward the house. "I told you. I'm not ready." Rachel squeezed her arm. "That wasn't for me. That was for me to enjoy later." Camille stepped in on Caroline's other side. "You're sharper this morning." "That sounds like an accusation." "It's an observation." Henry, walking just behind them with Leah, said mildly, "I've been married long enough to know that when women start describing each other as sharper, the rest of us should proceed carefully." Rachel looked back over her shoulder. "That's because you're trainable." Caroline laughed, really laughed, for the first time that morning, and the sound loosened something in her chest. The first hour passed the way these things always did. In small circles, broken conversations, introductions made by people who assumed everyone either already knew everyone else or would behave convincingly enough to suggest they did. Caroline was good at that kind of gathering. Perhaps too good. She knew exactly how to make herself useful and admired in the same 10-minute span. She could rescue a dying conversation, make one guest feel noticed and another one feel remembered, and flatter a house without sounding like she was appraising it for purchase. She moved through the gathering beautifully. She was aware of Leah somewhere near the edges of it all the time. Not orbiting her. Not guarding her. Just present. Sometimes talking to Henry. Sometimes standing with one of the men by the outdoor grill discussing boat engines in the low practical tone of someone who actually knew what she was talking about. Once, halfway through a conversation with a couple from Winnetka who were being kind in the exhausting way wealth often mistook for grace, Caroline looked across the lawn and found Leah laughing at something Rachel had said. Not a lot. Not loudly. But enough. It startled her. Not because Leah laughing was impossible. Because it looked different here. Less withheld. Less rationed. Rachel caught Caroline noticing and later drifted over with a fresh drink just to say, quietly and with enormous satisfaction, "You've looked for her 6 times in the last 20 minutes. Caroline accepted the drink. "That's a vulgar estimate. It's a conservative one. Rachel. Rachel lowered her voice. I think she's been waiting all morning to stop being good. Caroline turned her head just enough to look at her friend directly. That is a terrible sentence. That is a very accurate one. It was easier after that to avoid Leah for approximately 7 minutes. Then lunch began organizing itself in the loose, sunny way outdoor lunches always did. Plates appeared. Someone uncovered bread. Henry started opening another bottle. A woman in white linen asked whether anyone wanted oysters, as if the answer could be no. Caroline had just accepted a plate from the host when Leah appeared beside her. Not touching. Not close enough for anyone to call it anything. Close enough to change her breathing. "You've done enough smiling for one day," Leah said quietly. Caroline kept her eyes on her plate. "That sounds suspiciously like concern. It sounds like an exit." Caroline finally looked at her. Leah's face gave away almost nothing, but there was a clarity there that hadn't been present an hour ago. Not impatience. Decision. "And where exactly am I exiting to?" Leah took the plate from Caroline's hands before she could answer, and passed it to a startled cousin standing nearby with a murmured, "Would you?" The cousin, possibly because Leah said everything as if refusal would be both rude and inefficient, took it without question. Then Leah looked back at Caroline and said, "Come with me." Caroline should have asked more. Instead, she set down her untouched wineglass and followed. Not because it was wise. Because for the last week, wisdom had become a suspiciously limited concept around Leah Walker. They crossed the far edge of the lawn without announcing themselves. No dramatic departure. No scene. Rachel noticed anyway. Of course she did. So did Camille. Henry, catching Rachel's gaze, followed it once and looked away again with the gracious discretion of a man who understood when knowledge became a form of courtesy. Beyond the house, a narrower path cut down between trees and out toward a private dock half hidden by tall reeds and late-season brush. The sounds of the gatherings softened behind them. Voices, laughter, clink of glass, someone calling for more plates. The lake took over instead. Wind over water. Rope tapping softly somewhere against wood. The faint groan of something tied too long to weather. They walked side by side, not touching. Caroline broke first. "If this ends in a forced hike, I want it on record that this is a terrible abuse of power." Leah didn't look at her, but Caroline caught the smallest shift in her mouth. "You were warned to wear shoes you could walk in." That was not a full briefing. "No," Leah said. "You came anyway." There it was again, that new rhythm between them. Not cold. Not office sharp. Lower. Warmer. More dangerous for not trying so hard. The dock came into view all at once. Weathered wood, a small utility shed, a coiled rope, and beyond it a compact motorboat, tied at the end, clean and well kept without trying to impersonate anything larger or more expensive than it was. It wasn't flashy. That made it feel more intimate somehow. More hers. Caroline slowed. "This is yours." Leah stepped onto the dock first and held the post with one hand as if the answer were too obvious to dignify. "Yes." "You bought this yourself?" "Yes." That second yes carried a little more than information. Caroline looked at the boat again. Not huge. Not ornamental. Just beautiful in the self-contained way useful things could be when they were cared for properly. "You're full of surprises," she said. Leah looked back at her then, sunlight hard on the blue of the lake behind her. "No. You just keep meeting me in the wrong places." That line landed so cleanly Caroline didn't answer right away. Leah stepped down into the boat and reached up a hand, not as a romantic gesture, just matter-of-fact, practical, sure. Caroline took it. And because she had spent the whole week irritated, unsettled, watched from a distance by a silence that refused to become either apology or escalation, the simple act of stepping down while Leah studied her felt intimate enough to make her angry with herself. Once they were moving, the house receded quickly. Voices disappeared first, then the clustered shapes of people, than even the music someone had put on near the terrace. The lake opened around them, slate blue under the pale sun. Wind cleaner out here, the air colder and somehow easier to breathe. Leah drove the boat with the same economy. She drove the car with confidence, so complete it stopped looking like effort. No performance. No showmanship. Just knowledge. Caroline sat facing her for part of it, coat buttoned now, hair blown loose by the wind, watching the woman she had known only in pieces until recently settle into something whole. No schedule in her hand. No office behind her. No one asking for time access correction rescue. Just Leah. On water. In command of a smaller, truer world. You look less surprised than you should, Leah said over the engine and the wind. Caroline tucked hair behind one ear. I'm trying to recover my dignity privately. That suggests you had very high expectations for yourself. I usually do. Leah cut the engine as they moved into a quieter inlet. That sounds exhausting. Caroline smiled. You have no idea. Leah anchored near a curve in the shoreline where a stand of trees and a rocky point blocked them from the main view of the house. Not hidden completely. Hidden enough. The water was calmer here, darker, the boat rocking only in small, patient motions. She moved around the deck with easy certainty, checking the line, adjusting the anchor, securing one latch with the back of her hand as she turned. Caroline watched a moment longer than she meant to. You move like you've been doing this your whole life. Leah opened a small storage compartment and took out a canvas bag and a folded wool blanket. Close enough. That was not an answer. No, Leah said, glancing up. It was a warning. Caroline laughed softly. I'm on a boat in a hidden cove with you. I suspect I'm past warnings. That got a real look from Leah. The sort that seemed to settle on her skin instead of her face. Leah set the blanket on one of the bench seats beneath the small covered stern and took out wrapped sandwiches, fruit, a thermos, 2 metal cups, and a bottle of sparkling water. You plan lunch, Caroline said. Leah shrugged once. You sounded worried about that. I was joking. I wasn't. It should have been funny. It was. It was also something else. They sat facing each other on the cushioned bench seats, the blanket between them at first, the thermos uncapped, the whole boat carrying the quiet rhythm of water against the hull. It was not a grand meal. It was better than that. Chosen well, packed with thought, handled without fuss. You really do know how to take people hostage politely, Caroline said, wrapping her hands around the hot cup Leah passed her. You're not a hostage. No. Leah leaned back against the seat. No. You followed me willingly. That sounds suspiciously like blame. That sounds accurate. Caroline smiled into her coffee. They ate in a silence that didn't demand repair. The lake moved around them with a slow, dark gleam. A larger boat crossed farther out, and its wake reached them later in gentler pulses. The air was colder now, but the covered stern held the warmth of the cups and the closed-in feeling of a place just private enough to become dangerous. After a while, Caroline said, You're too good at this for it to be a weekend hobby. Leah looked out toward the water instead of at her. It isn't. Caroline waited. This time Leah didn't leave the silence to do all the work. My father built part of his life around water, she said. Boats. Rentals. Maintenance. The kind of business that keeps other people's weekends graceful if you know what you're doing. Caroline listened without moving. We were never poor, Leah said after a beat. People like to imagine stories one way or the other. Either hardship or entitlement. We were neither. We were fine. Better than fine some years. The wind shifted softly against the side of the boat. Leah went on, quieter now. Less arranged. I don't hate wealth. I hate arrogance. I hate people who think money covers everything else. Bad manners. Laziness. Cruelty. The kind of men who spend one good weekend in a nice place and start acting as if the world was built to forgive them for being unimpressive. Caroline let the words settle before asking, "And you thought I might be one of those people?" At first, Leah turned the cup in her hands. "I thought you might be adjacent to them." Caroline gave a soft, incredulous laugh. "That is a brutal category." It was also wrong. Something in Caroline eased at that. "Not fully." "Enough. What changed your mind?" Leah looked at her for a while before answering. "You listen when the answer matters. You don't enjoy humiliating people. You use charm to make a room gentler, not smaller." No one had ever said that to Caroline in exactly those words. No one had ever made it sound like respect instead of simple observation. She looked down at her cup, then back up. "You've studied me more than I realized." "Yes." The lack of denial should have made her laugh. Instead, it pressed deeper. Outside the covered stern, the afternoon had begun folding itself toward evening. The water was darker now, blue giving way to slate. The sky over the far shore had turned pale silver near the horizon. Caroline set her cup down beside her. "I should be annoyed by that." "You are." "Yes." Leah's mouth moved, almost a smile. "And?" Caroline held her gaze over the small distance between them. "And I'm not sure annoyed is still the most useful word." For a few seconds neither of them moved. The boat rocked once. A slow, careful shift. Leah set her own cup down then. Not abruptly, just with the kind of deliberateness that made Caroline's pulse go taut. She stood, crossed the small space between them, and held out a hand. Caroline looked at it once, then up at Leah's face. The wind moved one loose strand of Leah's hair across her cheek, and she didn't brush it back. "Come here," she said. Caroline gave her her hand. Leah drew her up from the bench, not fast, not tugging, just steadily until Caroline was standing too close in the narrow space beneath the covered stern. Then Leah took her other hand too. For one suspended second, they stayed like that. Hand to hand, breath to breath, the boat shifting softly under them, the sky draining toward evening beyond the edge of the canopy. No cleverness, no office polish, no sentence sharp enough to save either of them. Leah's thumbs moved once over the backs of Caroline's hands. Caroline could feel her own pulse there. And then, with a kind of quiet certainty that made everything in Caroline go still, Leah leaned in and kissed her. Not tentative, not testing, not the sort of first kiss people pretended could be innocent after a week like theirs. It was low and warm and already full of memory. Every unsaid thing from the Mustang, every cold-edged joke, every glance held half a second too long and released too late. Caroline made a small sound against Leah's mouth. She did not mean to make it all. Leah kissed her again before she could think. This one deeper. Slower at first, then not. One of Caroline's hands slipped free, only to catch at the front of Leah's field jacket, pulling her closer with more feeling than elegance. The kiss changed. Less controlled. Warmer. Hungrier. The kind that made the world reorganize itself around breath and hands and the dangerous discovery of reciprocity. Leah let go of Caroline's other hand only to put it at her waist, then farther around, drawing her fully in. Caroline's own hands left the jacket and found the warm skin just above Leah's shirt where it had shifted loose at the hem. The contact shot through both of them. Leah's breath changed first. Caroline felt that too. She kissed her harder for it. Leah's mouth moved from hers to the line below her ear, then down, and Caroline closed her eyes because the alternative was breaking apart where she stood. Her fingers threaded briefly into the hair at the back of Leah's neck. When Leah's mouth found the place where her neck met her shoulder, just above the open collar of her coat, Caroline's grip tightened. No one spoke. The boat rocked once, gently, as if the lake itself had felt the imbalance. Leah's hands spread over her back and pressed her closer. Caroline turned into it without thinking, mouth against the side of Leah's face now, then her jaw, then back to her mouth again. The edges of everything had gone soft and vivid at the same time. The wool of Leah's jacket under her palms, the warmth of her skin, the sound of their breathing in the covered space. By the time Leah's hands slid beneath the edge of Caroline's coat and flattened against the fine knit at her waist, Caroline had stopped remembering in any useful way that they were supposed to be anything to each other except this. She could feel the restraint going in Leah the way other people felt weather turn. It was there. It was losing. Caroline kissed her again, less careful now, one hand at the back of Leah's neck, the other sliding around her waist under the open jacket. Leah made a quiet, roughened sound into her mouth that went straight through her. Then she turned with Caroline until Caroline's back met the narrow inside wall of the cabin entrance, not trapped, only held. Held enough to make wanting sharpen into something unbearable. Leah pulled back only far enough to look at her. Both of them breathing too hard. Both of them already beyond the point of pretending this was harmless. Caroline's hair had come loose around her face. Leah's own looked darker, more disordered now, eyes deeper blue in the dimming light. Caroline had never seen her this undone. She wanted more of it. She wanted all of it. "Leah," she said, and heard in her own voice a plea she had not meant to expose. That seemed to land somewhere dangerous. Leah kissed her again, quicker this time, more desperate for it, her hands sliding up Caroline's side, thumb catching the edge of bare skin just above her waistband. Caroline inhaled sharply and then had no air left for anything but the feel of Leah's mouth, Leah's body, Leah's hand. It could have gone farther. Too easily. Caroline realized that at the exact same moment Leah did. Leah broke the kiss first. Not far. Just enough to leave both of them still breathing the same air, Caroline's hands still in her jacket, her own body still leaning into Leah's as the decision had already been made. For 1 second, Caroline thought maybe she would only pause. Maybe she would kiss her again more slowly. Maybe she would stop thinking entirely and do the honest thing instead. Then Leah shut her eyes briefly and pulled Caroline in harder against her, forehead dropping to Caroline's temple. Breath rough now, no longer even trying to sound controlled. "If I keep going," she said, voice low and wrecked by restraint, "this doesn't stay here." Caroline was still warm enough with anger and want that it took her half a second to understand. And Leah lifted her head just enough to look at her. Her hands were still on Caroline. She had not let go. "And I'm not doing halfway with you." The line hit like cold water. Not because Caroline didn't understand the words. Because in that exact second, understanding did absolutely nothing to soften the fact that Leah was still stopping. "Halfway," Caroline repeated, and heard the hurt in her own voice too late to hide it. "Is that what you think this is?" Leah's whole expression changed. Not defensive. Worse. Torn open in that quiet, controlled way of someone who had chosen truth and still managed to wound with it. "That's not what I said." "No," Caroline said. She stepped back first. Just enough to feel the loss of contact like an insult. "You just stopped." "Caroline." But Caroline shook her head once. Not dramatic, not messy, only wounded enough to make restraint look elegant. She turned away before Leah could finish. Not because she wanted distance. Because suddenly she wanted far too much and had nowhere useful to put it. She stood at the edge of the open stern with both hands lightly braced on the rail, looking out over the darkening water as if it might offer something simple, practical, and merciful. Behind her, she heard Leah move. Not closer. Just enough to tell Caroline she hadn't gone. That somehow made it worse. When Leah finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. Not hard. Not careful enough to stop hurting. "I'm not going to touch you like that and then ask you to walk back into Monday as if it meant less than it does." Caroline kept her eyes on the lake. If that was meant to comfort her, it failed spectacularly. Because all she could hear underneath was that Leah had still chosen the stopping. And in the body, in the ache of skin and breath and interrupted wanting, That felt a lot more like rejection than principle. By the time they untied and headed back toward the house, the light had dropped to gold and blue. The shoreline was darker. The first terrace lamps were on, low and warm against the gathering dusk. Voices carried farther now over the lawn. Someone had started music again, softer this time. They were both quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of two people with nothing to say. The opposite. Too much. Nowhere safe to put it. Caroline sat forward this time, looking out at the water instead of at Leah. She could feel the shape of what had almost happened still on her mouth, her neck, her waist. Every movement of the boat seemed to press that awareness deeper instead of shaking it loose. Leah drove as steadily as ever. That steadiness felt impossible. At the dock, Leah tied off the line without asking for help. Caroline stepped onto the wood first and waited only because leaving too quickly would have looked like injury. She was injured. That was not the same thing. They walked back toward the house through the trees with the evening fully around them now. Side by side. Not touching. The distance between them would have looked ordinary from far away. Nothing about it felt ordinary now. At the edge of the lawn, Caroline slowed. "We were gone long enough to be discussed," she said. "Yes. And?" Leah looked toward the terrace instead of at her. "Rachel will be subtle for 5 minutes. Henry for 20. Camille never will be." That almost made Caroline smile. Almost. She looked at Leah then, really looked, and saw the same thing she had seen before and resented now because it was still true. Leah wasn't withholding because she felt less. She was withholding because she felt too much and had chosen not to let that carry them somewhere careless. It should have comforted her. It didn't. Not yet. When they stepped back into the outer ring of the gathering, Rachel looked up first from the terrace steps and went utterly still for one beat. Then Henry glanced between them, took in the silence, and reached for a bottle of water before either woman asked. Camille, who had been leaning back in a wicker chair with one leg crossed over the other, rose and said calmly, "Well?" Rachel didn't even try to hide the concern now. "Are we pretending this is normal?" Caroline took the water from Henry and unscrewed it without looking at anyone. "Please don't." Rachel's face softened at once. So did Henry's, though more subtly. Camille mercifully said nothing at all. That was how everyone knew it was serious. The night resumed around them because nights always did. Someone asked Henry about the grill. A woman in Kashmir wanted to know whether anyone had seen the host's dog. The music changed. Glasses were refilled. A man Caroline vaguely recognized from 3 winters ago tried to start a conversation with her, and then thought better of it when she answered him too perfectly. Rachel came over once more an hour later, and sat beside Caroline on the terrace swing without speaking right away. That alone was extraordinary. Finally she said, "Do you need me to be funny or loyal?" Caroline looked out at the water. "I need you to be quiet." Rachel nodded once. "I can do that." And she did. Henry later pressed another bottle of water into Caroline's hand and murmured, "Whatever happened, you look like you won and lost at the same time." Caroline let out one soft, bitter laugh. "That is not helpful." "No," he said. "But it feels correct." Camille waited until the very end, when guests had begun drifting indoors or toward their cars, to stand beside Caroline near the steps and say, in the low, calm voice she used when she had already decided honesty was kinder than comfort, "You look furious." "I am." With her. Caroline stared straight ahead. With the timing. With myself. With the fact that she can do that and still act like restraint is the generous choice. Camille was quiet for a second. Then she said, "That doesn't sound like a woman who felt nothing." Caroline turned her head sharply. "That's exactly the problem." Camille's expression softened by a fraction. "No," she said. "It's just not the problem you want tonight." There was no good answer to that. So Caroline didn't try to make one. By the time Leah drove her back, the sky had gone fully dark and the car felt smaller than the last time, because now both of them knew exactly what it could hold. They said very little. The silence this time was not suspended possibility. It was consequence. When they reached Caroline's building, Leah put the car in park and kept both hands on the steering wheel. Caroline looked at the lights in the windshield, then at the lobby beyond them, then finally at Leah. For one stupid second, she wanted Leah to reach for her again. To take it back. To explain it better. To make stopping sound like something other than refusal. Leah only said, "You should get some sleep." Caroline laughed once under her breath. "That seems optimistic." Leah's hands tightened on the wheel. "Not much." "Enough." Caroline opened the door before she could ask for anything dangerous. Cold air cut in. She stepped out, shut it, and stood on the curb with one hand still on the top edge of the open window. Leah looked up at her. There were a dozen things Caroline could have said. None of them would have made her feel less abandoned in the exact place she had wanted too much. So she settled for good night. Not warm. Not cruel. Just final enough to protect what was left of her pride. Leah's voice when it came was lower than usual. "Good night, Caroline." She drove away before Caroline could decide whether she hated that softness or needed it. Inside the lobby, with the doorman tactfully becoming invisible and the whole building once again polished into quiet, Caroline felt the full shape of the day close around her. Leah had wanted her. That was no longer in question. Leah had kissed her, held her, stopped. And none of that made sense yet in the place where her body still remembered the opposite of stopping. By the time the elevator doors shut, one truth was all Caroline had left. Understanding would come later if it came at all. Tonight, all she had was want, anger, and the insult of being left trembling by a woman who had just admitted she wanted her too much for halfway. If part 3 pulled you into Caroline and Leah's day on the water, please like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments whether you think Leah was right to stop or whether you would have felt just as hurt as Caroline did. For each completed story, I share 1 to 3 members only audio extras that offer more time with the characters beyond the main series. They're available through her After Midnight Club on Buy Me a Coffee. The link is in the description. Every bit of support helps me create more stories like this for you.